Time is a gift. Cherish every moment with your loved ones.
Yes, Father, and hold our memories close.
In the spring of 1921, somewhere in a modest home on the outskirts of Philadelphia, a family gathered for a portrait. The photograph that emerged from that session would later be cataloged, archived, and nearly forgotten in the basement of a historical society. For decades, it sat among thousands of similar images, sepia-toned memories of ordinary American families trying to rebuild their lives after the devastation of the Great War. The parents are well-dressed, their clothing pressed and formal. The father stands tall, one hand resting on the back of a velvet chair, his expression serious but not unkind. The mother sits beside him, her lace collar immaculate, her hair pinned in the fashion of the era. Between them, seated on a low stool, is a child of perhaps 7 or 8 years old, hands folded neatly in the lap, dressed in a starched white shirt and dark trousers. At first glance, everything about this portrait speaks of stability, of a family that has weathered the storm and emerged intact. The room behind them is furnished with the trappings of modest prosperity: a patterned wallpaper, a wooden side table, a vase of dried flowers. Sunlight filters through a window somewhere beyond the frame, casting soft shadows across the floor. This is not the home of the wealthy, but neither is it one touched by poverty. It is the portrait of an American family in 1921, trying to project normalcy, trying to say we are here, we are whole, we are moving forward. And yet, if you look closely, if you allow your eyes to drift toward the center of the frame where the child sits, something begins to unsettle the warmth of the scene. It is not obvious at first. It does not announce itself. But once you notice it, the entire photograph transforms. Historians who first examined this image in the early 1980s found themselves returning to it again and again, unable to articulate exactly what disturbed them. One archivist described it as a photograph that feels like it's holding its breath. Another said that looking at it too long made her feel as though she were intruding on something private, something not meant to be seen. The debate over this single portrait stretched across decades, confined mostly to academic circles and collectors of Victorian-era photography. But the question that anchored every discussion was always the same: what is wrong with the child's face? Once you see it, once you allow yourself to truly look, you cannot unsee it. The investigation into this photograph began not with grand revelations, but with a simple, nagging discomfort. When archivists first digitized the image in 2003, they noticed something that had been easy to overlook in the faded, yellowed print. The child's face, though centered in the frame and sharply in focus, does not match the rest of the photograph. Not in lighting, not in texture, not in the way it relates to the space around it. The child's eyes are the first place the unease settles. While the parents gaze forward, their expressions neutral and composed, the child's eyes seem to look past the camera, or perhaps through it, fixed on something unseen. There is no warmth in them, no trace of the mild irritation or shy discomfort that so often marks children's faces in old portraits. Instead, there is a kind of hollow stillness and absence that feels deliberate. The mouth is closed, the lips pressed together in a flat line that suggests neither contentment nor distress. The posture is rigid, almost unnaturally so, with the shoulders squared and the hands positioned with mechanical precision. It is the posture of a child who has been told to sit very still and who has obeyed completely. But there is something more. The skin of the child's face appears smoother than it should, almost waxy in its evenness, lacking the subtle variations in tone and shadow that define a living face. Around the edges of the jawline and the hairline, the contrast between the child and the background seems too sharp, as if the face has been carefully cut from one image and placed into another. Forensic photo analysts who examined the portrait in 2011 noted irregularities in the grain structure of the emulsion around the child's head, inconsistencies that suggest the photograph was manipulated after the initial exposure. In the 1920s, retouching photographs was not uncommon. Studios would smooth blemishes, lighten shadows, even adjust the tilt of a head to improve composition. But this was something different. This was not enhancement. This was reconstruction. Comparing the child's face to other portraits from the same era reveals the depth of the anomaly. In typical family photographs of the period, children's faces carry the faint blur of movement, the slight asymmetry of a living, breathing subject. Even when sitting still, a child's face retains a kind of vitality, a subtle interplay of muscle and expression. But in this portrait, the child's face is flawless in its stillness, frozen in a way that feels less like patience and more like suspension. Early theories ranged from the plausible to the speculative. Perhaps the child was ill, weakened by fever or exhaustion, and that explained the vacant gaze and unnatural stillness. Perhaps the child had been frightened into compliance by a stern photographer or an overbearing parent. Perhaps the portrait had been taken after a long day, when exhaustion had drained the life from the child's expression. But none of these explanations accounted for the photographic inconsistencies, the subtle wrongness that seemed to radiate from the image itself. One analyst, speaking at a conference on historical photography in 2014, described the child's face as existing in a different temporal plane from the rest of the photograph. It was a strange way to put it, but it resonated with others who had studied the image. The child did not seem to occupy the same moment as the parents, did not seem to share the same reality. The photograph felt less like a family portrait and more like a composite, a carefully constructed fiction designed to present an image of wholeness where none existed. And as researchers began to dig deeper, to trace the origins of the photograph and the identities of the people within it, the discomfort that had always surrounded the image began to sharpen into something far darker. The trail into the past began with a name written in faded ink on the back of the photograph. The Calloway family, Philadelphia, 1921. From there, archivists turned to census records, city directories, and birth certificates, piecing together the lives of the people frozen in the frame. The father, Thomas Calloway, was a clerk for a textile importing firm, a position that afforded him a modest but stable income. He had served briefly in the war, stationed stateside, and returned to civilian life without visible scars. Public records paint him as unremarkable, a man who paid his taxes on time, attended church on Sundays, and kept to himself. His name appears in city directories from 1918 through 1925, always at the same address, 412 Linwood Avenue. The mother, Eleanor Calloway, is a more elusive figure. Her name appears on the marriage certificate from 1912 and on the birth record of their only child in 1913. But after 1923, Eleanor Calloway vanishes from public documentation. No death certificate was ever filed in Philadelphia County. No record of remarriage or relocation exists. It is as though she simply ceased to exist, erased from the historical record with the same quiet finality that marks so many women of that era. Neighbors who were interviewed decades later, their own memories faded and uncertain, recalled Eleanor as a quiet woman, always neatly dressed, always polite, but never warm. One elderly woman, speaking in 1987, remembered seeing Eleanor at the market in the early 1920s, her face pale and drawn, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked like a woman carrying a great weight, the neighbor said. But in those days you did not ask. You did not pry. The child's name was Michael. Michael Thomas Calloway, born April 3, 1913. His birth was recorded without complication, and for the first few years of his life, his name appears in church baptism records and school enrollment lists. But here, too, inconsistencies begin to emerge. A notation in the parish records from 1921 lists Michael Calloway's name with a small mark beside it, a cross that typically indicated death or departure. Yet no death certificate for Michael Calloway exists in the public record. No obituary was published. No grave was marked. The house at 412 Linwood Avenue still stands, though it has been subdivided into apartments and renovated beyond recognition. The original floor plan, however, was preserved in city planning documents from 1919 and it reveals a modest two-story structure with a parlor, a kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and a small attic space. Interviews with tenants who lived in the building during the 1950s described strange features that had been sealed off or covered over. An interior door that had been nailed shut, a section of the attic floorboards that felt different underfoot, as though something had been removed and hastily repaired. One tenant recalled finding a cache of old photographs hidden behind a loose baseboard, images of a child that looked unsettlingly familiar, though she could not say why. Those photographs were lost in a flood in 1963. By the time researchers attempted to locate them, they had been destroyed. But the memory of them lingered, described as portraits of a child posed in various settings, always alone, always with that same hollow, distant expression. The Callaways were not people of great significance in their community. They did not leave behind diaries or letters. They did not make the newspapers except for one brief mention in 1922, when Thomas Callaway testified as a witness in a minor property dispute. But those who remembered them, those whose own childhoods brushed against the edges of the Callaway family's existence, spoke of an unease that clung to the household. The curtains were always drawn. The child was rarely seen playing outside. And Eleanor Callaway, in the months before she vanished from the record entirely, was heard weeping late at night, a sound that carried through the thin walls of Linwood Avenue and was never explained. The year 1921 was one of cautious optimism in America. The Great War had ended, the boys had come home, and the country was attempting to return to something resembling normalcy. But beneath the surface of that optimism, the war had left scars that did not heal easily. Families struggled with grief, with trauma, with the quiet unraveling of men who had seen things they could not speak of. In the homes of that era, silence was a virtue. Discipline was strict, emotions were restrained, and the interior lives of families were hidden behind polished facades. The house on Linwood Avenue would have been a place governed by routine and order. Mornings began early, with the father leaving for work before dawn and the mother tending to the household chores with mechanical precision. Meals were eaten in silence. Children were expected to be seen and not heard, to obey without question, to reflect the respectability their parents worked so hard to project. Discipline in the 1920s was often harsh by modern standards. Corporal punishment was considered not only acceptable but necessary. A child who misbehaved might be struck, locked in a room, denied meals, or subjected to long hours of isolation as penance. These practices were rarely questioned. They were seen as the natural order of things, the way children were shaped into obedient, productive members of society. But in some households, discipline crossed into something darker. Behind closed doors, away from the eyes of neighbors and the judgment of the church, some parents inflicted punishments that left no visible marks but carved deep wounds into the psyche of the child. Fear became the governing force. Obedience was maintained not through respect but through terror. And in homes where violence simmered just beneath the surface, children learned to move carefully, to speak softly, to become invisible. The interior of the Callaway home, as described in architectural records and inferred from the few surviving accounts, was orderly to the point of sterility. The furniture was simple but well maintained. The walls were bare except for a few framed prints of pastoral scenes. The windows were covered with heavy drapes that blocked out much of the daylight, leaving the rooms perpetually dim. Upstairs, the bedrooms were small and sparsely furnished. Michael's room, according to a tenant who lived in the building decades later, was the smallest of the 3, little more than a closet with a narrow bed and a single wooden chair. The attic above was used for storage, but there were rumors, never confirmed, that it had also been used as a place of punishment, a space where a child could be locked away for hours or even days, left alone in the dark with only the sound of the wind and the creak of the rafters for company. Post-war households carried a particular kind of weight. Men who had returned from the front brought with them memories they could not process, trauma they could not articulate. In some cases, this manifested as emotional withdrawal, a cold distance that left wives and children feeling abandoned even as the man sat at the dinner table. In other cases, it erupted into rage, sudden and unpredictable, a violence that turned inward on the family itself. Thomas Calloway's war service was brief and stateside, but even those who did not see combat were not immune to the psychological toll of that era. The world had changed. The certainties of the old order had crumbled. And in the struggle to rebuild, some families fractured under the pressure. Inside the house on Linwood Avenue, the silence was profound. The neighbors recalled no laughter, no raised voices, no signs of life beyond the occasional flicker of a lamp in the evening. It was as though the house itself had learned to hold its breath, to exist in a state of perpetual suspension, waiting for something that never came. When advanced digital analysis was finally applied to the Calloway family portrait in 2015, the results were startling. Researchers at a university lab specializing in historical photographic forensics isolated the child's face and subjected it to a series of tests designed to detect alterations, composites, and post-processing manipulation. What they discovered confirmed the suspicions that had haunted the image for decades. The lighting on the child's face does not match the lighting on the rest of the photograph. While the parents are illuminated from the left, consistent with the placement of a window or studio lamp, the child's face is lit almost frontally, with a softness that suggests a different light source entirely. The shadows beneath the child's chin and along the sides of the nose are inconsistent with the shadows cast on the parents' faces. It is as though the child's face was photographed in a different room, under different conditions, and then carefully inserted into the family portrait. The texture of the photograph's emulsion also reveals irregularities. Around the child's head, the grain structure is finer and more uniform than in the surrounding areas, a telltale sign of retouching or collage work. In the early 20th century, photographers used a variety of techniques to alter images after exposure. Negatives could be physically cut and reassembled. Prints could be painted over with fine brushes and dyes. Multiple exposures could be combined to create composite images. These techniques were often employed for artistic purposes, to create memorial portraits of deceased loved ones or to correct flaws in the original photograph. But in the case of the Calloway portrait, the manipulation was not corrective. It was deceptive. Experts in postmortem photography, a common practice in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, immediately recognized the hallmarks of a memorial portrait. These were photographs taken of the deceased, often posed as though sleeping or seated among family members, a final image to preserve the memory of a loved one. In many cases, the deceased were retouched to appear more lifelike, their eyes painted open, their cheeks tinted with color. But by the 1920s, the practice had fallen out of favor, considered morbid and unsettling by the new generation. The Calloway portrait, however, suggests that someone attempted to integrate a post-mortem image of the child into a family portrait, creating the illusion that Michael was alive and present when the photograph was taken. The child's face, with its waxy smoothness and unnatural stillness, was likely photographed separately, perhaps days or even weeks before the family portrait session. The body in the photograph, the small figure seated on the stool, hands folded, posture rigid, may have been a stand-in, another child, or even a carefully arranged mannequin, dressed in Michael's clothing and positioned to create the illusion of a complete family. Comparisons to known memorial portraits from the same era reveal striking similarities. The vacant gaze, the absence of vitality, the eerie perfection of the face, all are consistent with post-mortem photography. But what makes the Calloway portrait so disturbing is not the fact that such techniques were used. It is the question of why. Why would a family commission such an image? Why would they go to such lengths to create the illusion that their child was still alive? And why, if Michael Calloway had died, was his death never officially recorded? The photograph was not created as a memorial. It was created as a lie. And the face of the child, frozen in that terrible stillness, was not meant to honor his memory. It was meant to erase the truth of his death. The answer came not from the photograph itself, but from a single document discovered in the archives of the Philadelphia County Courthouse. It was a probate record, filed in 1923, related to the estate of a distant relative of the Calloway family. Buried within the list of heirs and beneficiaries was a notation concerning Michael Calloway, described as the surviving child of Thomas and Eleanor Calloway. The notation was accompanied by a date, March 12, 1921. But a second document, a hospital ledger from St. Agnes Medical Center, told a different story. On February 28, 1921, a child named Michael Calloway was admitted with injuries described as severe trauma to the head and torso. The attending physician noted signs of blunt force impact, injuries inconsistent with a fall or accident. The child died in the early hours of March 1, 1921. The cause of death was recorded ambiguously as internal hemorrhaging resulting from undetermined trauma. No further investigation was pursued. No autopsy was ordered. The body was released to the family the same day. And yet, according to the probate record filed 2 years later, Michael Calloway was listed as alive on March 12, 1921, 11 days after his death. This discrepancy is not a clerical error. It is evidence of deliberate falsification, a manipulation of official records designed to obscure the true date of the child's death. The reason for this deception becomes clear when one examines the terms of the will in question. The distant relative, a woman named Margaret Henley, had left a modest sum of money to be divided among her surviving nephews and nieces, with specific provisions that heirs must be living at the time of her death on March 10, 1921. If Michael Calloway had been recorded as dead on March 1st, he would have been excluded from the inheritance. By falsifying the date and commissioning the family portrait as proof of life, Thomas Calloway ensured that his son's share of the inheritance would pass to him. The doctor's notes, though vague, carry an undercurrent of suspicion. The phrase injuries inconsistent with accident was a euphemism commonly used when medical professionals suspected abuse, but lacked the authority or willingness to pursue charges. In 1921, the rights of children were poorly protected. Parents held almost absolute authority over their households. A child's death, particularly if it could be attributed to an accident or illness, was rarely investigated thoroughly. Thomas Calloway's position as a clerk in a reputable firm, his standing in the community, and his war service would have afforded him a degree of deference. It is likely that the physician's suspicions were noted but not acted upon, filed away in a ledger and forgotten. Eleanor Calloway's role in this tragedy remains unclear. Did she know what her husband had done? Did she participate in the deception? Or was she coerced into silence? The fact that she vanished from the public record after 1923 suggests that the weight of what happened in that house became unbearable. Perhaps she fled. Perhaps she broke under the strain. Or perhaps she, too, met an end that was never recorded. The portrait itself was sent to relatives as part of the probate claim, presented as evidence that Michael was alive and well in March of 1921. It was a carefully constructed piece of fiction, a visual lie designed to secure money and protect a reputation. The child's face, inserted into the photograph with such precision, was not an act of love or remembrance. It was a tool, a means to an end, a final exploitation of a child whose life had already been stolen. To return to the photograph now, knowing what we know, is to see it transformed. The child's face is no longer simply unsettling. It is an accusation, a silent testimony to a crime that was buried beneath layers of deception and forgotten by history. The hollow eyes that stare past the camera are the eyes of a child who suffered and died, whose death was hidden, whose memory was manipulated for financial gain. The rigid posture, the waxy smoothness of the skin, the eerie stillness, all are remnants of a truth that someone tried desperately to conceal. The photograph, meant to deceive, became instead a piece of evidence. Not legal evidence, not the kind that could bring justice or closure, but evidence nonetheless. It is a document of cruelty, of a family that valued money and reputation over the life of a child, of a society that looked away when the truth was too uncomfortable to confront. In the decades since the photograph was taken, it has passed through many hands. It was kept by relatives who did not understand its significance. It was donated to historical societies, archived among thousands of similar images. It was digitized, studied, and debated by researchers who felt the unease it radiated but could not initially explain it. And now, knowing the story behind it, the photograph takes on a new weight. It is no longer just an image. It is a memorial not to a life celebrated, but to a life erased. How many other photographs exist, hidden in attics and archives, carrying similar secrets? How many other families constructed careful fictions, posed for cameras with smiles that hid violence and loss? The technology of the early 20th century made such deceptions possible. The social norms of the era made them easy to conceal, and the passage of time made them easy to forget. But the child's face in the Calloway family portrait has not been forgotten. It lingers, frozen in that terrible stillness, a reminder that the past is not always as warm and innocent as it appears. It is a reminder that behind the posed smiles and carefully arranged furniture, there were lives lived in silence, in fear, in pain. And sometimes, if we look closely enough, the truth emerges from the shadows, written in the hollow gaze of a child who was never allowed to speak.